Okay, so for this week we are going to be doing a mission to Minmus, which is the smaller of the two moons that orbit Kerbin, and it is also the furthest away, and we're going to be hopefully returning a crew safely from there. And so we're going to again be starting in the vehicle assembly bay, and I sped most of this video up just because the entire thing ended up being about 40 minutes, and I don't want to have to talk over that whole thing, and you probably don't want to have to watch it. That said, the first thing we're going to start designing is the lander. I'm going to start off with this Apollo-style command pod, and right below it I will be using a heat shield to protect the craft during re-entry. And you can also see me here adding, I tried the Wolfhound engine, but you'll see I swapped it out earlier, and I'm also adding some of these little Oscar B fuel tanks on the sides just to make our center of mass a little bit lower. And I've also added a parachute, which is that little blue nose cone at the top, and we will deploy that in our re-entry to slow us down after the heat shield has done most of the work for us and we are at a safe altitude to deploy it. So I'm here attaching some batteries just to give us some electric charge and strutting the fuel tanks to the main body just to make sure that we are stable when we're landing. And I've also added some ladders to allow our little astronauts to disembark and plant our flag on the moon. So I'm adding some more ladders there, as well as the solar panels, which I will use to recharge the batteries because we don't want to be caught way out away from home without the batteries, and that will leave us unable to rotate, fire the engines, anything, and we will be pretty much stranded. So right here you can see I am bounding all of the deployable things on there, like the solar panels and the antenna, to one action group. So just like last time, I can press one button and I'll deploy it all. And right now I am just trying to figure out a good setup for my engine here. I thought about going for a Terrier engine, but it didn't have a good enough thrust-to-weight ratio, so you can see here I switched to the, I think it's called the Poodle engine, and it is not very powerful, but it gives us a decent thrust-to-weight ratio, and it is very vacuum efficient. It has a good specific impulse. So right here you can see I'm adding a decoupler, and there's the aerodynamic fairing again, if you remember that from last time. I'm also just strutting the body of the ship to the fairing, and I'm going to build this around the ship to not only protect it as it goes up, and I'm also going to put it on there to make the entire craft more aerodynamic and produce less drag as we ascend. Here I'm looking again for a good engine for my interplanetary stage, and I eventually ended up settling on the Rhino because it, for this engine, it tried to attach a small shroud, which wouldn't have worked on the main body. So I went with that Rhino there because of its vacuum efficiency, and it provides a good amount of thrust so that I don't have to do painfully long burns. At the bottom here, just like last time, I'm adding a really big fuel tank and giving us a pretty powerful engine just to help us get off the ground, and it is not very efficient at ground level, but it provides us that amount of thrust that we need to get off the ground. And here I was thinking of adding 2 peripherally mounted boosters, but I figured that looking at the craft's thrust-to-weight ratio and the amount of delta V in this stage, I figured that it had a sufficient amount, and I wouldn't need to add 2 more boosters, just because that would mean we would be expending more fuel than we needed, and that would just make the whole craft a lot less efficient. So I'm also adding the clamps there and arranging my staging and making sure the whole thing is ready for flight, checking my crew. And I also added those fins on the side. Again, I probably don't need 2 sets of 4 there, but I just want to make sure that this is very easy to control in flight. So we're going to go ahead and get ready for liftoff. So right here you're going to see that after I've turned on the stability assist, I'm going to fire up to 2/3 maximum throttle. And and we have liftoff. And you notice there that I fired the engines before I released those clamps, and that's just to make sure that all 4 of those engines at the very bottom of the craft, they are fired at the same time, and we would be ready to go once we took off. And so I'm going to speed the footage up to just 3 times speed here as we ascend, because we've already seen this last week. And just like last time, I'm going to be slowly tilting towards the right with the rotation of the planet, trying to stay as close to my prograde marker on the nav ball there as I can. And you can see right here I hit 45 degrees at 10 kilometers, which is the most ideal flight plan that you can take to get into orbit for small crafts like this. It varies depending on the mass of what you're trying to launch, but for this, that should be a reasonable size. I'm still, right there you saw I just switched to pointing prograde, which will create the smallest amount of drag on the craft. And there is a flame out and separation. And now we are onto the Rhino engine, and this is going to take us the rest of the way into orbit and then on our way to Minmus. So there I'm creating a maneuver node in my apoapsis and dragging out that prograde marker until our periapsis appeared and we can get a circular orbit. Here I am circularizing with that Rhino engine, and I didn't get a perfect orbit on this one. I think it was about a 5 kilometer separation between my apoapsis and periapsis, but I figured it was close enough for a Minmus mission. So that yellow line there you see is Minmus's orbital path, and I'm just trying to get my maneuver node there set up so that whenever I burn there, it will intersect Minmus's gravity well. And I didn't get it quite perfect, but I got it as close as I could within a reasonable distance. So I'm going to do this main burn to raise our apoapsis way up there, and then you'll see here in a minute I'm going to do a correction burn to try and just get my Minmus periapsis about 50 kilometers away from the surface, which takes some messing around. This is also going to be a direct ascent mission, meaning that we'll launch this entire craft. The entire thing will land on Minmus, and the entire thing will return home, as opposed to Apollo style, where there's a mothership and a lander that goes down onto the planet, and then meets back up with the mothership and returns home. And so this isn't very realistic because we actually haven't done a direct ascent mission in real life before, but since Kerbal Space Program is scaled down by, I think it's a factor of 1/8, it's definitely a lot more doable and easier here. So with my correction burn there, my maneuver node wasn't able to get it perfect, so what I'm doing here is I just set the maximum thrust of my Rhino engine to 1%, and I'm just doing some manual adjustments, burning prograde, retrograde, normal, anti-normal, until eventually I was able to get a equatorial intersection with Minmus. So here you can see I am just warping to my Minmus periapsis, and I'm going to burn retrograde so that I can get in a good orbit around Minmus. And I just went for 50 kilometers because it's a nice safe height. There's no risk of me crashing into the planet. And there's also no atmosphere on Minmus, so I don't have to worry about my orbit degrading due to drag. So here I'm going to use this last bit of my Rhino engine fuel to just get our periapsis to intersect this big flat plane that you saw on the map there. And even though I still got a little bit of fuel here, you're going to see I'm going to decouple it right here. And that will crash into the surface, and I can switch to my much more efficient and much more reasonably powered Poodle engine. And this is going to be the engine that I use for the majority of the descent. So the first thing that I'm going to want to do here is I'm going to first start burning retrograde a little bit to see, just to test my thrust to weight ratio and see how it reacts to the engine. So now I'm going to get off my retrograde marker here in a second, right there, and I'm going to just try and kill off all of our horizontal speed, and this will make it so that we don't hit the ground at a weird angle and send the craft flying. And so there you can see I've killed off most, if not all, of our horizontal speed, and so now my retrograde marker is pointing directly towards the ground. And you can hear the interplanetary stage crashing into the ground way over there. And so I'm just slowly burning retrograde here as I get closer and closer to the ground. And I'm moving the camera there to get a little better angle, and we are also deploying the landing gear to just keep us from damaging the engine. I mean, we technically could have done this mission without landing gear and just balanced on the engine, but it's obviously not very realistic. And so I'm going to be aiming to be touching the ground at around 1 meter per second, hopefully no more than that. I'm just going to be as gentle as possible. And we are touched down. So I'm going to rotate the craft here a little bit just so that we're coming out on the light side, power up the engines a little bit. And I've got about 2,000 meters per second of delta V in this stage, which is more than enough to get back to Kerbin. So here we are on Minmus. You can see we're on that big flat area. And now we are going to take our hero Jebediah Kerman in the bottom right there. We are going to take him on an EVA where he will get out, climb down these ladders, and plant our little flag here in the dirt. See, hops along there. So plant our flag with the NASA logo on there. Can't really see it because I planted it the wrong way. And all that done, cinematic shots taken, we are going to run back towards the lander and hop back in so he can join the rest of his friends. And so here I'm just looking at the nav ball, and I'm looking to be pointing east. It took me a second to get it, so I'm going to retract all of the antennae, landing gear, or ladders and solar panels, just to make sure that they don't, for whatever reason, get damaged during the ascent. And I'm also going to retract the landing gear, and I'm going to start pointing to my left, and that's actually, I found out a little bit late, I was pointing the wrong direction there, so I just quickly adjusted to the right here in a second. There we go. And I'm just going to be, just like on Kerbin, I'm going to be raising my apoapsis to a reasonable height that's safe away from the planet, and then burning prograde at periapsis to get back into orbit around Minmus. And so now that I'm in orbit, I'm going to create my maneuver node and try and get my periapsis on a collision course with Kerbin. So I'm going to execute that burn and warp around the planet. And right there. And so now I've basically expended all the fuel that I'll need to for this mission, and I've still got a comfortable amount of fuel left in this stage. I think it's got about 1,000 meters per second of delta V, which is plenty, but I'm not actually going to end up using it. So I'm just going to lower our periapsis a little bit more and then separate that, and I'm going to slow this down here to normal speed because there's just a lot to unpack here. So the first thing is that if you notice, my periapsis isn't actually intersecting the planet, and I've got my periapsis at about 20 kilometers off the surface. And the reason for that is I want to be coming in at a very sharp angle so that I have the most time to produce as much drag as possible, and I don't have to worry about overheating. But when I'm coming in at such a steep angle. And so you can see those flames are licking the side of the command pod because I'm coming in right now at about 3 kilometers per second. And the friction from us moving that fast through the air is creating that kinetic energy and turning it into flames on the side of the pod. And so you'll also notice that the pod has got sort of a weird shape, and it's shaped like that so it has a low center of mass. And that ensures that will ensure that it keeps us from flipping around, and we're able to produce as much drag as possible, which ordinarily isn't good. But when you're re-entering, you want to be able to slow down as much as possible in order for us to be able to deploy our parachute at the top. And so I've got that heat shield at the bottom of the craft just to protect the whole thing from this heat, because ordinarily it would probably cause the metal to melt, and our little Kerbals in the bottom right would not survive. So it's got the heat shield is covered in a blader, which is very heat resistant, and you can see we've already slowed down to about 1.5 kilometers per second, and slowing down even more as we re-enter. And so the lower we get, the hotter it'll get, but also the slower we go. and so I'm just waiting until we finally get to a safe speed where I can deploy the parachute. And so we're just now passing 1,000 meters per second, and I can see those red flames are gone. And even though the flames are gone, we're still draining speed. We're at about 350 meters per second right now. And we are now at a safe height to deploy the parachute, and right now it will stay half deployed, just so that we don't have to spend the next 3 hours floating down. But this will slow us down to around 220 meters per second, and then it will fully deploy, which will slow us down to about 10 meters per second, which you'll see here in a second. There it is. And so at that moment, the Kerbals experience about 10 Gs when it deploys there, so it can be a little bit dangerous. But we're going to jettison our heat shield there, which will decrease the mass of the craft and allow us to slow down even more so that we are absolutely guaranteed safe when we hit the water here. So they're just floating down, ready to get back home. And we're going to hit the water here at about 8 meters per second, which is a little bit fast, but that's about as light as we can make our craft. And so there's a successful splashdown. So that was our first extraterrestrial mission. Next week I'm planning on doing a mission to the Mun, which is the closer and larger of the two moons that orbit Kerbin. I'm thinking about doing a Apollo-style mission for that one, whereas this one was direct descent, like I said earlier. So, of course, any feedback's appreciated, and that's about it. See ya.